All right, Owen, it's been a great year for movies.
It really has.
Can't remember the last time I had such a hard time making my top 10 list. I mean, you had major blockbusters like Black Panther out there. You had art films like The Favorite. All of these kind of like knocking at the door, and yet, to get to a list that was really 10 films that I connected with personally meant leaving out a lot of great work. I'd be curious to hear what your top 10 list looks like.
Well, I'll tell you, Peter, I agree with you. I mean, I could have made a 30 best list this year and stood by every one of them. My number one film of the year, and I'm happy to say, this is what I always hope for, I didn't choose it, it chose me, is A Star is Born.
Oh, great.
Because I think it is a transcendent romantic movie. But more than that, there's this mythic power I feel with this film. I feel like it reaches back into Hollywood's past, but it also shows us what Hollywood can be in the future. Another film I loved this year was the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which I thought brought off almost a kind of miracle in telling the story of Mr. Rogers and showing how his message of love and empathy that he taught children is now the message that our whole society has lost. I loved two docudramas that came out that not everyone loved, but they both spoke to me. One was Chappaquiddick, the movie about the Edward Kennedy scandal of 50 years ago, but what I thought was amazing about it is that it wasn't just a film about an old incident. It was about the post-war legacy of liberalism losing its integrity, and I think something that is still haunting us today. And I loved First Man. A lot of people didn't, but to me, Damien Chazelle's film reconfigured the space program into something just revelatory and with a new level of danger that I'd never seen in how it was portrayed, and that raised the human stakes. Just real quickly, two other films I loved. One was the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country about the Rajneesh cult.
Oh, no, that's an interesting choice.
Their battle with a small town in Oregon. Just a revelatory movie that really kind of speaks to today. And also the Sundance hit Eighth Grade. An amazing, intimate look not only at the middle school experience, which is sort of universal and eternal, but I thought in a way the first great movie about what it's like to grow up in the digital age and the pressures of that, the unique pressures.
Eighth Grade made my list as well, and I think this is such an interesting year because the conversation about representation and who gets to tell what stories, and just seeing characters that aren't always the center of movies become really the focus. Bindspotting, for me, was a movie that I discovered also at Sundance, and just nothing unseated it as far as just a movie that really hit me as being so ambitious. It's sort of inspired by the Oscar Grant shooting of 2009 in Oakland. It's set in Oakland. For me, seeing that was a discovery like Do the Right Thing must have been in its era. Just a movie that's really challenging the audience. Right behind that for me is A Star is Born. Like you, that's a movie that just really hit me dead in the heart, and it reminds me why I love movies in the first place. I also loved the movie that won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It's a Japanese film called Shoplifters. Yep. The director, Hirokazu Koreeda, has spent his entire career just asking and examining what family is, and this to me is the most interesting permutation of that. The movie The Hate U Give also is a film I discovered at Toronto.
Fantastic movie.
This relationship between the lead character who's black and her white boyfriend, and what it means for the way that he sees or doesn't see her race, and the way that she has to shift back and forth her persona between her home life and this kind of posh, rich school she's
incredibly
going to.
Complicated, complex, and passionate film.
Of course, Eighth Grade comes next. I loved Mission Impossible, which again is one of these movies that just delivers on the highest level what we want from a blockbuster. And there's a Mexican movie called Museo that it's worth pointing out. That movie is about two friends who rob artifacts from a Mexican museum, and who owns them in the first place?
Well, speaking of films set in Mexico, there is a certain film that I feel compelled to talk about because it was not on either of our lists, and it is a very acclaimed film, and that is Roma. Roma is a film I've seen twice. I liked it very much, but both times I saw it, I felt almost physically distant from the movie. And to be honest, it bothered me a little bit that it was about this character who I think is a bit of a saint. I wish he was a little less of one.
It's interesting because I also like the movie. I think more than you do, but for me, it is still his fourth best film. He's an incredible filmmaker.
And
it not being on my list is a reminder of that point we sort of started out with, where it's one of those films like a dozen others I could name that are kind of knocking at the door, wanting to be 11th, 12th, through 20th place on my list.
Absolutely. Maybe a year where you can afford not to have Roma on your 10 best list. That's a testament to what a year it was.
Well said, yeah.